Hello, everybody. I'm Rod Green. I'm involved with a struggle against mass incarceration, and I'm happy to be here, at least by video, to tell you a little bit about some of the campaigns that we've been involved in. We've pulled together a coalition of organizations, including the Prince George's County People's Coalition for Police Accountability, the Occupy DC Criminal Injustice Committee, and the New Jim Crow Group for Change, to try to spread the word about the battle against mass incarceration and to try to change the way this society deals with the problem of mass incarceration. I wanted to tell you just first a little bit about a historical context for racism in the United States, because that's at the heart of the mass incarceration situation, and it's also why we've decided to take on a boycott of the Wells Fargo bank. I also want to share some information with you about private prisons and detention centers, about the GEO Corporation and Wells Fargo itself. And then I'm going to say a little bit about some of the activities that we've been carrying out to try to continue this campaign against Wells Fargo. The reality is the Boycott Wells Fargo campaign is part of a much broader movement to fight against mass incarceration, racism, and their roots in the capitalist system. The campaign is really a step on the road to revolutionizing our society and the broad changes that are needed to achieve our liberation. Wells Fargo is really just the tip of the iceberg of racism and mass incarceration, a very important tip, and is an entry point to the bigger issues in the U.S. It might be helpful to have a little stylized history of how at least I see the history of this country. I think it was established and built on racism. The colonial period combined the enslavement of Africans and oppressed indentured servitudes of Europeans into a powerful form of exploitation of plantation labor. When the unity of these oppressed workers threatened the landowners in Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, systematic racist laws were passed in England and enforced in the colonies, and these laws were explicitly to divide black and white workers from each other. Enslaved Africans, now separated from their white fellow workers, were exploited to create enormous wealth over the coming decades, wealth for the plantation owners and not for anyone else. But in addition, as industry grew, the industrialists also benefited greatly from slavery because the cheap cotton enabled them to make even more textiles. But the Civil War ended slavery, and then Reconstruction following the war threatened to bring black workers into equal status with other workers, creating the foundation for a potentially unified working class. Well, the capitalists would have none of that. The Compromise of 1877 fastened Jim Crow segregation tightly on the African American population, essentially reestablishing a slave-type system, this time throughout the entire United States, not just the South. The Civil Rights Movement and the urban rebellions of the 1960s and 70s once again challenged the system, threatened to establish racial equality once again, and that is so dangerous to the captains of industry who had learned to rely on racist divisions in the working class to make profits and keep our class divided. And so the capitalists again responded, this time with a war on drugs and the system of mass incarceration, aimed at deepening the super-exploitation of African workers while keeping black and white separate, weakening families and communities while stigmatizing a major part of the African American population. The new Jim Crow serves a function very similar to that of slavery and the old Jim Crow. Maintain the African American community in a secondary, vulnerable, and second-class position. And now the Latino population is in many ways faced with the same situation. The U.S. capitalist system, it seems, can only thrive and survive with intense racism. The fight, though, against the new Jim Crow offers once again the possibility of uniting the working class in their struggle against the capitalist system and its exploitation. We need to make the most of this opportunity and build a mass, powerful, multiracial movement against racism. Now a little bit about the mass incarceration and the private prison system. The development of the perverse private prison for profit system has been made possible by the mass incarceration of African Americans and more recently of Latino immigrants. Prisons in the United States held 300,000 inmates in 1970. Today, there are 2.3 million people in prisons, with over 7 million more under the supervision of the criminal justice system. That's a qualitative change. In 1980, private adult prisons did not even exist in the United States, but by 1990, there were 67 privately run facilities that caged about 7,000 people. By 2009, the number of people incarcerated in private prison had grown to 129,000, which is about 6% of all those incarcerated, and it's growing rapidly. Rivers Correctional Institution, a private prison in North Carolina, run by the GEO Group, currently incarcerates over 1,000 D.C. residents of the District of Columbia who have been incarcerated far from their homes. The private prison system has also gotten involved in the immigration detention process, with over half the people locked up at immigration facilities in the United States incarcerated at privately run facilities. The two largest private prison companies, GEO Group and the Corrections Corporations of America, have grown with alarming speed. While not even in existence in 1980, 30 years later, the two companies combined earned nearly $3 billion. And of course, the CEOs of these companies each made over $3 million each. Private prisons are profit-making entities that need an increased flow of prisoners and minimum services provided them to keep making big profits. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which lobbies for all kinds of reactionary policies, I think we're all pretty familiar with them, works diligently to keep mandatory minimum sentences, three-strike legislation, and so-called truth in sentencing policies in place as a way of keeping the prisoners and profits flowing into these companies. Reflecting this perverse money-making incentive, the CCA wrote in its 2005 annual report the following incredible statement. It says, "The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them." Boy, wouldn't that be a shame if they lost some profit because some people were not in jail. In line with their goals of massive expansion, CCA made a proposal to 48 different states in this country. They said they would be willing to operate their prisons on a contracted out basis for 20 years if the states would guarantee that the prisons would always be filled at least at 90% capacity. I don't know if any states have accepted this yet, but the very proposal is preposterous. The stories of mistreatment in these facilities are legion. We have spoken in our work on the street with many returning citizens from GEO's Rivers facility in North Carolina. And we've heard about systematic neglect and lack of services. The ACLU systematically studied private prisons in Georgia, another example, and found in them severe human rights violations with beating, sexual abuse, unwarranted isolation, and other horrors. And this, GEO Corporation, this is the organization that Wells Fargo loves because they are so profitable. So a few words about Wells Fargo, getting to the meat of the matter here. Wells Fargo Bank began in 1905 in San Francisco and immediately showed its attitude after the 1906 earthquake. You'll remember that earthquake or read about it. It was one of the most devastating earthquakes, created huge fires, devastation throughout the entire city. Did Wells Fargo care about the fires, death, and destruction? No. The message it put out immediately after the earthquake was, building destroyed, vault intact, credit unaffected. That was their thinking on it. Since then, it has swallowed up bank after bank, including most recently Wachovia Bank, and now is the fourth largest bank in the United States in terms of assets, $1.3 trillion, and first in terms of the market value of its stock, $181 billion. It employs over 270,000 people and has more than 9,000 branches throughout the country. So we need your help in getting to all these 9,000 branches. It's clearly part of the financial oligarchy that dominates the U.S. and much of the rest of the world. In the same way that the private prison industry boosts their profits by expanding the system of mass incarceration, Wells Fargo plays a pivotal role in providing financial services and investment to the private prison industry, thereby profiting handsomely itself. In particular, Wells Fargo is a major partner and collaborator with the GEO Group, enabling both to profit from the incarceration of prisoners across the U.S., including those from the District of Columbia. Wells Fargo's ties with GEO are many and complex. It owns about $130 million worth of stock and serves as the major financial sponsor of GEO. It actually owns 4.5 million shares of GEO stock. It's about 7% of all of the stock. It's a trustee for $300 million worth of senior notes issued by the GEO Group last year, and they earn fees for that for the 10-year life of those notes. And there's several other ways that Wells Fargo plays a key intermediary role for GEO Corporation. And we also know that Wells Fargo doesn't just carry out its nasty business with regard to private prisons. More recently, it was found guilty of racist discrimination in its mortgage business and was forced to come up with $175 million as a fine for its racist discrimination in the subprime scandal in Baltimore and Prince George's County. So Wells Fargo is guilty on many fronts. It is a well-rounded racist. Now, what is the fight back going on about this? There is a nationwide campaign going on. It's not just in the Washington, D.C. area. The campaign is calling for Wells Fargo to sever its ties to GEO Corporation and the Corrections Corporation of America. And the struggle has had many high points. This last year's annual meeting of Wells Fargo was disrupted by boycotters, each of whom bought a share of stock so they could go to the meeting and raise a resolution along the lines of what I've described. And instead of course, listening to this, they called the police and arrested 20 of the protesters as they were demanding that Wells Fargo break its ties with GEO corporations. There have been rallies and protests all around the country in Philadelphia, in Washington, New York, Phoenix, and many other cities around the country. We are, in short, part of a growing national movement, and we hope you will become part of it as well. Locally, in the Washington, D.C. area, we've been agitating around Wells Fargo branches in the District of Columbia and in Prince George's County, and we'll be expanding into Montgomery County soon. We have also launched a petition campaign demanding that the District of Columbia cease using Wells Fargo for its financial activities. The thing is, if you can get a big guy like a local government or a major organization to withdraw its funds from Wells Fargo, that has much more power than an individual doing it. But yet we want everyone, especially lots and lots of our brothers and sisters throughout the country, to start by withdrawing their own accounts. I would say that now is the time to build and rebuild a bold, militant, anti-racist movement that unifies the working class in the fight against racism, that reliable tool of the bosses to keep us terrorized, passive, and divided. I hope that you will join us in this campaign to end Wells Fargo's ties to the private prison industry. Thank you.